In the bitter winter of 1872, the narrow streets of Harrowgate, an industrial port town on the coast of New York State, seemed to hold a darkness that no gas lamp could chase away. It was not the biting wind from the Atlantic, nor the hunger of the working-class families who struggled to survive after the Civil War. It was something far more terrifying. Children were vanishing into the frozen dusk, or worse, being found in alleyways and abandoned sheds, beaten, scarred, their tiny bodies marked by a cruelty no one could comprehend. Whispers spread from one tenement to another. There was a predator among them. Mothers barred their doors after sundown. Fathers walked their sons to school in silence. And even the church bells seemed to toll with unease. But the greatest horror was not only in the savagery of the attacks. It was in the growing realization that the monster stalking Harrowgate's children was not a grown man hiding in shadows, but a child himself. A boy, no older than 12, with a milky, clouded eye that made him look less like one of their own, and more like something that had stepped out of a nightmare. His name would be whispered for decades to come. Edwin Grayson, the boy with the marble eye. Some would call him the Red Imp of Harrowgate. Others would say he was the first true child killer America had ever seen. But no one could ever explain how innocence had turned so quickly, so completely, into a force of pure malice. What you are about to hear is not simply the chronicle of a boy's crimes. It is the story of a town forced to confront the unthinkable. That childhood could harbor evil every bit as dark as adulthood. It is the story of a legal system stumbling through new territory, trying to decide if justice could be measured by age when the crimes were so monstrous. And above all, it is the story of how trauma, neglect, and secrecy can twist a life into something unrecognizable. Before we step deeper into Edwin Grayson's world, I ask you this: if stories like this one unsettle you, if they make you think differently about the past and the darkness it concealed, then share your thoughts below. Subscribe to follow more tales like this, and comment. Do you believe a child can truly be born evil? Or are they shaped that way by the cruelty around them? Your perspective matters here. Now, let us return to Harrowgate, to the flickering gas lamps and the sound of hammering shipyards, to the house where Edwin's story began. November 12th, 1860. Inside a cramped tenement overlooking the docks, Martha Grayson labored through a long, icy night to bring her second son into the world. When the midwife lifted the baby to the candlelight, silence fell. One of the boy's eyes gleamed with a strange, pearly whiteness, the entire pupil hidden under a film that seemed almost opaque. The women present crossed themselves. The midwife muttered something about a curse carried in the blood. Henry Grayson, the boy's father, stepped forward, a man hardened by years as a Union soldier who had seen too much death in the war. His reaction was not tenderness. He looked down at the newborn with revulsion. "Not right," he spat, turning away. That moment set the tone for the years to come. From infancy, Edwin was denied warmth. Henry worked brutal shifts at the dockyard, returning home reeking of oil and iron, and when he looked upon his son, he saw only deformity and shame. The father's beatings were harsh and ritualistic, carried out in the woodshed behind their home. They were not just punishment. They were designed to humiliate, to break the spirit of the boy who bore his name. Martha, by contrast, became Edwin's only source of comfort. But her love was twisted by denial. When neighbors whispered that the boy frightened their children, when complaints arose that he had been cruel to animals, Martha waved it away as loneliness. "He's misunderstood," she whispered to Edwin, as she bathed his wounds after another of Henry's rages. "The world doesn't see you as I do. You are special, Edwin. They just don't understand." But Harrowgate understood enough. Children taunted him as Marble Boy or the Devil's Son, throwing stones at him in the schoolyard. Teachers, overworked and overwhelmed, treated him as a disruption best ignored. He was left alone, and in that solitude, he turned to penny dreadfuls, cheap books filled with stories of frontier violence, of torture, of scalpings and ambushes. Where other boys read for adventure, Edwin studied. He memorized. He imagined. By the age of 10, he had already begun acting out these stories on the few creatures weaker than himself. Cats and stray dogs went missing near the docks. When their mutilated bodies were found, neighbors muttered suspicions, but nothing was proven. Martha always shielded him, and Henry, disgusted, simply withdrew further, leaving his son in silence or fury. It was in this crucible, abuse from his father, misplaced protection from his mother, rejection from his peers, that Edwin Grayson's hunger began to grow. A hunger not for food nor for love, but for control, for power over another being, for the sight of fear. And by the winter of 1871, when Edwin was just 12 years old, that hunger would finally break through its boundaries. No longer would stray animals or whispered threats suffice. He was ready to turn his gaze toward other children, smaller and weaker than himself, to become both predator and executioner in the alleys of Harrowgate. This is where the story of Edwin Grayson, the boy with the marble eye, truly begins. The story of Edwin Grayson cannot be understood without first returning to the cramped rooms of his childhood home in Harrowgate, where the sounds of hammering from the shipyard never ceased, and where the air itself seemed heavy with soot, salt, and unspoken tension. The Graysons were not wealthy, not even comfortable. Their tenement faced the docks, where ships moored and unloaded with the groan of chains and the curses of laborers. Edwin's father, Henry, was one of those men, his hands perpetually cracked and blackened by tar, his lungs thick with dust from years of hauling, hammering, and welding at the yards. He had once been a soldier, hardened by battlefields where boys were cut down as easily as wheat. But for all the death he had witnessed, nothing unsettled him more than the face of his own son. From the first moment he saw the milky haze clouding Edwin's right eye, Henry considered the boy an abomination. In the taverns, he called his son a punishment sent by Providence. At home, he made no secret of his disgust. When Edwin stumbled in the narrow hallway, Henry's hand came down on him not with correction, but with fury. When the boy hesitated to answer, the belt lashed across his back. The punishments were not random. They were ritualistic, conducted in the woodshed out back where the smell of rotting wood mingled with rusted tools. There, Henry forced his son to strip bare, to stand trembling as the leather whip cracked against his skin. The beatings went beyond discipline. They were acts meant to erase any sense of worth the boy might cling to. If Henry was the source of pain, Martha Grayson became the source of confusing solace. She was not blind to her husband's cruelty, but her love for Edwin took the form of desperate rationalization. After each brutal whipping, she would kneel by his bedside with a damp cloth, cleaning the welts and whispering, "They do not see you, Edwin, but I do. You are different, not cursed." She wrapped his loneliness in the language of destiny. In her eyes, his isolation was proof of specialness, not sickness. Neighbors saw things differently. When Edwin's pale gaze followed them down the street, they muttered to each other. Mothers pulled their children closer, murmuring prayers when the boy passed. Some claimed the child's eye had the look of the devil's marble. Others went further, saying the Grayson family blood had always carried something tainted. Harrowgate was a town of gossip, and Edwin became its favored subject. At school, the cruelty was no less vicious. In an overcrowded classroom where one teacher struggled to manage 60 children, Edwin was a target. The other boys circled him in the yard, chanting, "Marble boy, devil's son." Rocks struck his shoulders, spit landed on his shoes, and no hand ever reached to defend him. Teachers labeled him peculiar, intractable, impossible to reach. He was left alone, sometimes hiding behind the schoolhouse, clutching tattered penny dreadfuls. These books, cheaply printed tales of frontier wars and bandits, were filled with descriptions of violence. While other children read them as entertainment, Edwin studied them as if they were manuals. He memorized the ways knives were used, how prisoners were broken, how fear was inflicted. Even his brother, Thomas, wanted nothing to do with him. Barely a year older, Thomas thrived where Edwin withered. He was handsome, popular, quick to charm the neighborhood girls. To him, Edwin was a shadow, a shame to be ignored. Though they shared a bedroom, Thomas often slept in the kitchen rather than endure his brother's presence. And so, Edwin grew up in a vacuum of warmth. His father's hatred taught him pain. His mother's protection taught him denial. His peers taught him cruelty. His books taught him how to turn cruelty into craft. The first real signs of what lay ahead came in whispers from the alleyways. Cats, dogs, and birds vanished, only for their lifeless bodies to be found in refuse piles or floating along the riverbanks. There were marks, stab wounds, burns that no accident could explain. Neighbors suspected the boy with the pale eye. Some confronted Martha. She shook her head, insisting Edwin was merely lonely. But in the privacy of his mind, Edwin was beginning to feel something different, something powerful. For the first time, he could silence the sting of his father's whip by becoming the wielder of pain himself. By his 12th year, the transformation was nearly complete. His isolation had fermented into hunger. But Edwin's rage was never directed toward the strong, never at his father, never at the boys who mocked him. In his distorted reasoning, the powerful could not be touched. Instead, his gaze turned toward the weak, those even smaller, even more vulnerable than he had been. Children too young to defend themselves. They would become the mirrors in which he played God. What began in the woodshed as the breaking of his spirit would soon spill into the streets of Harrowgate, where innocence itself would be broken. By the winter of 1870, Edwin Grayson was no longer just the awkward boy with the pale, clouded eye who lingered at the edges of the schoolyard. He had begun to act out the images that filled his imagination, those lurid tales of torture and cruelty copied from the pages of his penny dreadfuls. At first, the evidence seemed like coincidence. A neighborhood cat gone missing, a dog limping through the street with a wound no one could explain. But soon, the patterns grew undeniable. Stray animals turned up in alleys, lifeless and marked by deliberate cruelty. Cuts, burns, and strange piercings that suggested not recklessness, but calculation. Neighbors whispered, and eyes turned toward the boy who watched them all with that ghostly gaze. Martha Grayson heard the complaints. She saw the suspicion in her neighbor's eyes. Yet, when confronted, she folded her arms and answered firmly, "He is lonely. You mistake sadness for cruelty." She convinced herself her son's strange behavior was the product of bullying, of rejection, of a heart that longed for companionship. But deep down, in the silences between their conversations, Edwin's mother must have felt some flicker of fear, because Edwin was changing. He no longer cried after his father's whippings. He no longer hid behind the schoolhouse in shame. Instead, he began to watch, to study. When children played in the alleys, he stood apart, his good eye following their games with an intensity that unsettled anyone who noticed. He observed who wandered away first, who strayed farthest from their mother's calls, who trusted easily. It was as though Edwin were practicing, rehearsing for something larger. He experimented with words, forcing himself to smile, though the expression felt wrong on his lips. Sometimes he tried to lure smaller children with pebbles, with trinkets stolen from his mother's sewing box. When they ignored him, his face would darken, and he would mutter to himself in the corner. There were moments, too, when cruelty slipped into plain sight. Once in the schoolyard, a sparrow flew too low. Edwin caught it in his hands before anyone else could react. At first, it looked like he might release it, but then he squeezed until the bird fluttered violently and went limp. When a teacher demanded to know why, Edwin's reply was chilling in its simplicity. "I wanted to see what it felt like." The other children recoiled. From that day forward, his isolation deepened. No one played with him. No one dared to stand too close. Yet this suited Edwin. He had learned that fear itself could be a kind of power. It was the one currency he had never held in his father's woodshed, the one force denied him in the classrooms and on the streets. But here, in these small, private acts of domination, he felt it at last. Even Thomas, his older brother, could not stomach being near him. Once, Thomas walked in to find Edwin crouched in the kitchen, pressing pins into the waxy surface of a candle as though it were flesh. The sight repulsed him. He muttered something about a sickness of the mind and left, slamming the door. To Thomas, Edwin was not a sibling but a shadow, a reminder of something tainted in their bloodline. Meanwhile, Henry's hatred only sharpened. The father saw his son as proof of divine punishment, and his beatings grew harsher, more creative. Stripped in the woodshed, Edwin endured lashes that left him bleeding into the dirt. But something inside the boy had shifted. Instead of breaking him, the cruelty began to harden him, to mold him. He started to imagine not just surviving, but returning that pain in kind. Not to his father, that would be too dangerous, but to someone smaller, weaker, someone he could control absolutely. He carried this hunger with him like an ember in his chest, and when the chance came, he tested it in the smallest ways. He learned to draw children in with soft words, practiced in front of a cracked mirror in the tenement hallway. "Come with me," he whispered to no one. "It will be fun. I'll show you something." Each rehearsal chipped away at the remnants of conscience. By the end of his 12th year, Edwin Grayson was no longer just the lonely boy reading about violence. He had crossed an invisible line. The cruelty was no longer imagined, no longer contained to animals or fleeting moments of impulse. It had become a deliberate pursuit, a hunger that demanded more. And soon, in the back streets of Harrowgate, Edwin would find his first true victim. The winter of 1871 fell heavy over Harrowgate. Snow piled against the tenement doors, smoke from coal stoves clung to the rooftops, and the narrow streets echoed with the sound of children playing when the cold allowed it. For most, these moments of laughter and games were a small escape from poverty. But for Edwin Grayson, they were something else entirely. They were opportunity. By then, he had already rehearsed the words in private, already practiced the smile that never reached his eyes. He had studied which children wandered alone, which ones trusted strangers, which ones longed for a bit of candy or companionship. The plan had formed in his mind with the precision of an architect. All he needed was the right moment. It came on a gray December afternoon. 4-year-old Samuel Turner, tiny even for his age, with curls that peeked from under his wool cap, had been sent by his mother to fetch bread from the bakery 2 streets away. Samuel's family was poor but respectable. His father worked long shifts at the iron foundry, and his mother took in laundry. The boy often ran small errands, something common enough in a neighborhood where children learned independence early. Edwin had watched Samuel before. He knew the boy's routine, knew that he often dawdled near the fence where horses were tied, knew that no one ever walked him home. That day, Edwin stepped from the shadows of a narrow lane, his voice smooth and low. "Do you like candy?" he asked, pulling from his pocket a few sugar drops he had stolen from his mother's shop. His good eye glimmered. His cloudy one seemed to fix on nothing and everything at once. Samuel hesitated, but the sight of sweets was enough. Edwin crouched, smiling in a way he had practiced so many times before. "I know a place," he continued. "A secret place where we can play. I'll show you. It's warm inside." The child, innocent in the way only the very young can be, slipped his small hand into Edwin's without protest. Together they walked away from the bustle of Harrowgate's main street, past the sound of the shipyard hammers, into the hushed emptiness of the outskirts. Edwin led him to an abandoned shed near the edge of Powder Mill Lane, a place he had scouted days before. Its roof sagged with rot, and the smell of damp wood filled the air. But to Edwin, it was perfect, isolated, hidden, a stage upon which to test the performance he had imagined for so long. Once inside, the mask of gentleness fell away. Samuel's trusting smile faded as Edwin's voice grew cold. "Take off your coat," he ordered. The boy whimpered, confused, but Edwin's hands were already at work, tying, restraining, pressing him into helplessness. For the first time, Edwin felt what he had been craving, the total power of one being over another. He didn't kill Samuel. Not yet. Something in him held back from that irreversible step. But the violence he inflicted was enough to leave scars that would never heal. The small boy was eventually found hours later, battered and barely conscious, lying in the freezing dark of the shed. When neighbors carried him home, his lips blue from cold. The Turners wept with relief that their son was alive. But in his fevered whispers, the child spoke of the boy with the strange eye who had promised candy, who had smiled like a friend, but turned into something monstrous. The police searched the area but could not comprehend that a child, barely older than Samuel himself, could have done such a thing. Their minds searched for an adult predator, a lurking man. The idea that one of Harrowgate's own boys was capable of this level of cruelty was beyond them. And so Edwin remained free, his secret intact, his hunger stoked rather than satisfied. That night, alone in his small bed, Edwin felt something he had never known before: exhilaration. The fear in Samuel's eyes replayed in his mind like a favorite story. For the first time, he was not the victim in the woodshed, not the outcast in the schoolyard. He was the one in control. He was the one who decided. And though the boy had survived, Edwin knew the experiment had succeeded. He had discovered his purpose. The marble-eyed child of Harrowgate would never again be content with watching from the shadows. This was only the beginning. In the weeks after young Samuel Turner was found battered in the shed, the people of Harrowgate clung to a fragile hope. Perhaps it had been an isolated incident, a cruel act by some nameless drifter who had since moved on. But the hope did not last. By February of 1872, whispers grew into panic. 2 more boys, both no older than 7, vanished on separate afternoons and were later discovered near the salt marshes beyond town. They were alive, but barely. Their bodies marked with strange welts and punctures. Their eyes told the story more than their wounds, the wide, haunted stare of children who had looked into something no child should ever see. Both boys, when pressed, described their attacker in eerily similar words: a bigger boy, brown-haired, no older than 12 or 13. And most disturbingly, they both mentioned the eye. One described it as like a cloudy marble. The other whispered that it looked like a ghost staring through me. The police of Harrowgate struggled with these accounts. To their minds, the predator had to be a grown man. A child, they reasoned, could not tie knots so tight, could not plan with such cunning, could not inflict pain so methodically. Yet the victims' descriptions would not change. Meanwhile, Edwin grew bolder. Each attack became not only an act of violence, but also an experiment. He varied the tools he used: splinters of wood, bits of rope, even pins and needles he carried in his coat pocket. He forced his victims to endure humiliation, stripping them of dignity as much as safety. It was not only about hurting, it was about studying. Edwin watched how long they cried when they stopped fighting, what frightened them most. For him, the children of Harrowgate were no longer peers. They were specimens. Martha Grayson noticed changes in her son. He came home late, his clothes dirty, his hands trembling with a strange excitement. But when she asked where he had been, Edwin only smiled faintly and muttered something about exploring. There were stains on his sleeves she pretended not to see. Scratches on his knuckles she dismissed as accidents. Deep in her heart, a dread was growing. But denial is a powerful shield, and Martha wielded it like armor. The community, however, could not deny the pattern. Parents forbade their children to walk alone. Neighbors formed groups to escort little ones to school and church. The alleyways that once echoed with the laughter of street games now lay silent. And in every whispered conversation, a name began to form. Not Edwin Grayson. No one outside his family yet suspected him. Instead, they called the phantom who prowled their streets the boy with the marble eye. The phrase passed from mouth to mouth, from taverns to marketplaces, until it became legend. Children spoke it in hushed tones, daring each other to whisper it after sundown. To some, it was a ghost story. To others, it was all too real. Edwin, for his part, heard the whispers and felt a strange sense of triumph. The power he once lacked in his father's woodshed, the respect he never found in the schoolyard, he now commanded them in shadows. He was feared. And that fear fed him more than any meal his mother could place on the table. But Edwin was not content to remain a phantom. With each passing week, his cruelty deepened, his methods grew sharper, and his need to push boundaries became unbearable. What he had begun with Samuel Turner had not been enough. The taste of fear only sharpened his hunger. And as winter gave way to spring, Edwin Grayson prepared for an act that would take him further than ever before. An act that would blur the line between torment and death. The spring of 1872 brought no relief to Harrowgate. The ice melted from the cobblestones. Ships returned to the harbor, and yet an invisible frost lingered in every parent's heart. Fear had settled into the town like a fog, thick, inescapable, and waiting. It was April when Edwin Grayson chose his next victim. 7-year-old Michael Dwyer was the son of an Irish dock worker, a quiet boy who often ran errands for his mother. Edwin had watched him for weeks, noting the way Michael lingered near the bakery on Larch Street, the way he wandered home alone without hesitation. On the afternoon of April 14th, Edwin approached him with the same disarming smile he had practiced countless times. "Do you want to see something secret?" he asked, holding out a trinket, a tin soldier he had stolen from another child. Michael's eyes widened. He nodded. Edwin led him to a derelict storage shed at the edge of the shipyard, a place so consumed by rot that the workers rarely bothered to enter. Inside, the air smelled of rust and mold. Light filtered through gaps in the boards, falling across piles of discarded rope and broken barrels. Once the door shut, Michael realized too late that the boy he followed was no friend. Edwin's demeanor shifted in an instant, the soft tone of his voice turning sharp. He forced Michael to the ground, tying his wrists with cords scavenged from the refuse. The smaller boy cried, pleaded, called for his mother, but Edwin's cloudy eyes seemed to drink in the sound. This time, Edwin crossed a threshold he had never dared before. He pressed a jagged shard of metal against Michael's skin, leaving shallow cuts that oozed blood. He struck him methodically with a broken plank, each blow deliberate, each pause filled with Edwin's careful study of the boy's terror. And then, in a chilling escalation, Edwin pressed the child's face into a pool of stagnant water gathered in the floorboards. Michael thrashed violently, choking, his lungs filling with brackish liquid. Edwin pulled him back only when the boy's body began to slacken, just shy of death. It was a rehearsal, a cruel test of power over life itself. Edwin lingered in the shed, watching Michael's sobs, feeling the trembling of his small frame. For a fleeting moment, he considered finishing what he had begun. His fingers tightened on the shard of metal, hovering over the boy's throat. But something, perhaps fear of discovery, perhaps the remnants of restraint, held him back. He released the child, gathered his tools, and vanished into the dusk. Michael was found hours later by dock workers, his body bruised, his lips swollen from near drowning. He survived, but barely. And when he could finally speak, his words chilled every ear in Harrowgate. It was a boy with a white eye, like a marble. The description spread like wildfire. Now the town could no longer deny it. This was not the work of some faceless stranger. It was one of their own, a child who moved among them unseen. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers walked the streets at night with lanterns and cudgels. But the fear remained. For how could one guard against a predator who looked like every other boy in the schoolyard? Edwin, meanwhile, felt something new. The drowning. The moment when Michael's body went slack. This had awakened in him a hunger he had not known before. He had been inches from taking a life, and the thought thrilled him. The hesitation that had restrained him once was vanishing. The boy with the marble eye had discovered the edge of death, and soon he would have no reason left to stop. The summer of 1872 should have been a season of relief for the Grayson family. Henry Grayson, bitter and broken from years of labor and his own demons, finally abandoned his home without a word. One morning, he simply did not return from the docks. No farewell, no note, no explanation. Only silence where his heavy boots and his harsh voice had once filled the rooms. For Martha Grayson, it was both a devastation and a liberation. She had endured her husband's cruelty for years, had patched Edwin's wounds while soothing herself with the lie that his behavior was misunderstood. Now, with Henry gone, she convinced herself she had been given a chance to start over, to rescue her son from the darkness she refused to name. She packed what little they owned, gathered Edwin and his elder brother Thomas, and moved across the river to the crowded district of Southmere, a place teeming with immigrant families, dockhands, and factory workers. Southmere was a different world from Harrowgate. The streets buzzed with activity, shops crowded close together, Tenements stacked floor upon floor, their windows staring down like watchful eyes. To Martha, it was an opportunity. A new neighborhood, new neighbors, new routines. She told herself the move would cleanse her family of its troubles, that Edwin's behavior had been the result of bullying and superstition in Harrowgate. "Here," she whispered to him as they unpacked in their narrow apartment on Broad Street. "You can be different. You can be free of what they said about you." But the truth was that Martha's decision did not erase Edwin's darkness. It fed it. For Edwin, Southmere was not a fresh start. It was a new hunting ground, a place where no one recognized his face, where the whispers of Marble Boy had not yet spread, where children played without fear of him. He realized something more chilling still. His mother would protect him no matter what. She had shielded him in Harrowgate. She had denied every accusation. She had uprooted the family rather than admit what he was becoming. In Edwin's mind, this was proof. Proof that he could continue, that he could grow bolder, that consequences were illusions. Thomas, meanwhile, drifted further from his brother. He found work selling papers on the street corner, eager to earn his own pennies and spend as little time as possible under the same roof with Edwin. In the evenings, he returned to the apartment exhausted, exchanging only a few curt words before disappearing into bed. To him, Edwin was not a sibling to be saved, but a shadow to be avoided. But Edwin was not hiding in shadows anymore. Southmere invigorated him. The crowded streets, the anonymity, the abundance of children. It was as if fate had delivered him a theater for his cruelest instincts. He began watching the neighborhood boys the way he once watched stray cats. Their habits, their patterns, their vulnerabilities. It did not take long for the first victim of Southmere to appear. Barely 2 weeks after the Graysons moved in, fishermen discovered a boy on the beaches south of town. His body bore marks even more savage than those inflicted in Harrowgate. Bites, scratches, punctures from sharp objects. The child lived, but the scars would follow him forever. Whispers spread quickly through Southmere, but no one connected it to the boy who had terrorized Harrowgate. The police saw only an isolated atrocity, unable to imagine that the same hand had struck again. For Edwin, it was intoxicating. He had crossed the river and left behind suspicion, only to find himself freer, more powerful, more certain than ever that he was untouchable. The boy with the marble eye had found his new dominion, and Southmere would soon learn what Harrowgate already knew too well, that Edwin Grayson did not stop. He escalated. The move to Southmere should have been a new chapter, a place where the Graysons could vanish into the crowded streets and begin again. But for Edwin, it was not escape. It was evolution. On the 17th of August, 1872, just 2 weeks after arriving, Southmere awoke to whispers of horror. Local fishermen, checking their nets in the dim light of dawn, stumbled upon the battered body of George Pratt, a boy of 7. He was alive, but only just. His small frame was swollen with bruises, his cheek torn by human teeth, his arms covered with scratches that looked like they had been carved by fingernails. The men who found him swore they had never seen such deliberate cruelty. George, trembling and half-conscious, muttered the same description others had given in Harrowgate. A boy, older but not a man, with brown hair, and an eye that looked like a marble cloud. The attack was more savage than anything Edwin had done before. In Harrowgate, his methods had been brutal, but there was still a measure of distance, blows with boards, cuts from shards. Now Edwin had crossed into something more personal. He used his own body, his nails, his teeth, as weapons. It was not only violence, it was intimacy. A desecration of innocence by the touch of another child. The community was stunned. In Harrowgate, parents had grown cautious, had begun keeping their children indoors. But here in Southmere, they had not yet learned to fear. And Edwin exploited that ignorance. 3 weeks later, on September 11th, he struck again. This time, his victim was Joseph Kennedy, another boy of 7. Edwin had watched him for days, tracking his errands to the corner shop, noting how often he was sent alone. He lured him with promises of candy and games, then led him to a vacant boathouse at the edge of the marsh. There, Edwin escalated still further. He used a pocket knife stolen from a shop, dragging its edge across Joseph's face, leaving wounds that would scar for life. He forced the child's head beneath the saltwater again and again, pulling him back each time to prolong the terror. This was not impulsive cruelty. It was deliberate, calculated, and, most terrifying of all, enjoyed. When Joseph was found hours later, coughing and bleeding, he described his attacker with startling clarity. "A boy," he whispered, "with an eye like a stone." By now, the police had no choice but to acknowledge the impossible. They were not chasing a phantom adult, but a child. Yet they struggled to act. Southmere was crowded with boys who matched the vague description: brown hair, slight build. The only distinguishing mark was the eye, and Edwin knew how to lower his head, how to avoid the gaze of adults, how to pass unnoticed in a sea of faces. But Edwin himself felt no fear. On the contrary, he felt invincible. His mother had uprooted their lives once already to shield him. The police had never suspected him. The victims could describe him, but who would believe children claiming a child was their tormentor? Every attack deepened his confidence, and confidence made him reckless. On September 17th, only 6 days after the boathouse attack, railway workers discovered another boy tied to a telegraph post near the tracks. His name was Robert Gould, and he bore knife wounds along his arms and legs. Edwin had pressed the blade to his throat, intent on ending his life, but was startled away by approaching footsteps. Robert survived, and his account was more damning than any before. He described not just the cloudy eye, but Edwin's voice, his manner, his smile that turned suddenly cruel. The authorities of Southmere, bewildered and terrified, realized they were chasing a boy whose violence was escalating beyond anything they could imagine. And Edwin? He relished it. To him, Southmere was a theater, and each attack was a performance more daring than the last. But soon, his arrogance would betray him. The attack on Robert Gould changed everything. Until then, Edwin Grayson had remained a phantom, feared in whispers but unconfirmed. Now, for the first time, a victim gave the authorities a description so precise that no one could dismiss it. "It was a boy," Robert told them, his voice shaking, "with brown hair, and one eye, white, like a marble. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a real smile." The detail of the eye struck the police like a thunderbolt. It was too unusual to be coincidence. That description began to circulate quietly among officers, though few dared speak of it publicly. Could it truly be possible that a child was responsible for such cruelty? The notion defied every assumption of justice, of childhood itself. But in the cramped apartment on Broad Street, Martha Grayson did not need the police to tell her. She had already read the newspapers with descriptions that made her blood run cold. She had heard neighbors murmuring about the boy with the marble eye. And each time Edwin returned home, his clothes disheveled, his face flushed with a feverish energy, her dread deepened. One evening she confronted him. "Edwin," she whispered, her voice trembling, "tell me the truth. Were you there near the marshes? Did you hurt that boy?" For a long moment, Edwin said nothing. He simply stared at her, the milky film of his right eye catching the lamplight, making his gaze appear both empty and endless. Then, slowly, a faint smile curled on his lips. Not a smile of innocence, nor even of denial. A smile that said he knew she would not betray him. Martha's breath caught in her chest. She should have gone to the police. She should have admitted what she knew in her heart. But denial had become her refuge. She told herself that confessing would mean losing him forever, that perhaps the move to Southmere had not been far enough, that perhaps another change, another chance, could cure him. So she said nothing. Instead, she smoothed Edwin's hair and murmured, "You must stay out of trouble. Do you understand? People talk. They don't see you as I do." It was a choice that sealed the fate of children she would never meet. For in protecting her son, Martha Grayson condemned others. Meanwhile, Edwin grew reckless. The knowledge that his mother suspected but did nothing emboldened him. He no longer feared discovery. He lingered longer with his victims, left more evidence behind. He began to understand with a dark thrill that the power he held was not only over children, but over adults as well. Over his mother, over the community, even over the police who groped blindly in the dark. But arrogance is a dangerous companion. It blinds even the cunning. And soon, Edwin would make the mistake that shattered his anonymity forever. September 20th, 1872. The air in Southmere was thick with the smell of coal smoke and salt from the nearby marshes. Children, fewer than before, played cautiously under the watch of anxious parents. And in the shadow of the police station on Main Street, Edwin Grayson lingered. Why he stopped that day, no one could say. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was arrogance. Perhaps it was the hunger to see, with his own eyes, what happened after his games had ended. He peered through the cracked window of the station, pale fingers pressed to the glass. Inside sat 7-year-old Joseph Kennedy, the boy Edwin had dragged to the boathouse, the boy he had cut and nearly drowned. Joseph was flanked by officers, his small hands trembling as he spoke. His voice wavered, but his words were clear. He described his attacker, the brown hair, the crooked smile, and most of all, the marble eye. Joseph's eyes drifted toward the window, and then they widened in terror. He saw him, the boy with the cloudy eye, the one who had nearly killed him. "That's him!" Joseph screamed, pointing wildly, his face ashen with fear. "That's the boy! That's the marble eye!" The station erupted into chaos. Officers bolted for the door, storming into the street. Edwin froze for a heartbeat, caught in the act of watching his own aftermath. Then he turned, but it was too late. Hands seized him, dragged him inside, pressed him against the wall. He did not struggle. When the officers confronted him, Edwin's response was not denial, not tears, not the frantic protests of a child. Instead, in a flat, chilling voice, he said, "Yes, I did it." The confession silenced the room. Grown men, police hardened by years of violence in the streets, stared at the 12-year-old boy who spoke with the calm of an adult criminal. They had expected resistance, excuses, perhaps even weeping. What they saw instead was indifference. One by one, his surviving victims were brought in. Each child, upon seeing him, recoiled. Some cried, some screamed, but all pointed to the milky eye. There was no doubt left. The monster haunting Harrowgate and Southmere was not a phantom. He was not a man lurking in alleys. He was a boy. News spread with the speed of fire. Crowds gathered outside the police station, desperate to glimpse the face of the marble-eyed devil. Mothers held their children close. Fathers muttered oaths of vengeance. And yet when Edwin was led out in shackles, escorted by officers, the crowd gasped. Not because he looked monstrous, but because he looked so ordinary. Thin shoulders, a boy's face, hair unkempt from the struggle. The only thing that set him apart was the eye, white and clouded, staring past the crowd as though he saw nothing at all. That night, the town lay restless. Some prayed for justice, others whispered in fear. But all knew one thing. Childhood innocence had been shattered. They had seen it with their own eyes. And for Edwin Grayson, the mask was gone. He was no longer a shadow. He was exposed, caught, and bound for judgment. The courtroom in Southmere had never been so crowded. By September 21st, 1872, word of Edwin Grayson's arrest had spread across the county. Farmers abandoned their fields, dock workers left their shifts, and mothers packed into the gallery, all desperate to see the face of the boy who had haunted their nights for more than a year. Judge William Forsyth presided from the bench, his expression ashen. He had seen theft, drunkenness, even murder. But nothing in his decades of service had prepared him for this. A child, barely 12, standing accused of orchestrating crimes so brutal that hardened officers struggled to describe them aloud. Edwin was brought into the chamber in plain clothes, his wrists bound. The room gasped, not at some terrifying figure, but at his ordinariness. He looked like any boy who might fetch water from the pump or sell papers on the street corner. Only when his head turned did the spectators see it, the milky, clouded eye that had become legend. Murmurs rippled. The marble eye. It's true. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. One by one, the surviving victims were called. Their voices shook, but their words were steady. They described the promises of candy, the friendly smile that turned to cruelty, the blows, the cuts, the suffocating fear. And each time they were asked if the boy who hurt them sat in the room, they pointed at Edwin. Their fingers trembled, but there was no doubt. When Edwin himself was questioned, he showed no shame. He confessed calmly, describing details of the attacks in a tone so flat it chilled the courtroom. His words were not the desperate fabrications of a frightened child. They were the precise recollections of someone who had studied his acts as though they were lessons. "I wanted to see what it felt like," he told the judge when asked why. Gasps filled the chamber. Some in the gallery wept, others cursed aloud until bailiffs silenced them. Never before had they seen such indifference to human suffering. The defense attorney, Charles Robbins, struggled. His argument hinged on Edwin's age. "He is but a child," Robbins pleaded, "a boy shaped by a cruel father, by isolation, by torment from his peers. How can you condemn one so young as though he were a man?" He attempted to invoke pity, to suggest insanity. Experts were called to speculate on the boy's mental state, to argue that no sane child could do what Edwin had done. But the evidence spoke louder. The rope knots, the knives, the careful luring. These were not random spasms of madness. They were planned, calculated. Edwin's lack of remorse only reinforced the image that haunted everyone. This was no ordinary child. After 2 days of testimony, the gavel fell. Edwin Grayson was found guilty of his attacks, yet the law of the time was unprepared. He could not be sentenced to prison like a grown man. Instead, Judge Forsyth delivered the maximum punishment available for one his age: 6 years at the State Reform School in Westboro. The crowd erupted, some in outrage, some in relief. For many, the sentence was far too light. Mothers clutched their children and shouted that he would return worse than before. Others whispered that perhaps the boy could be reformed, that perhaps under guidance he might be saved. As Edwin was led away in shackles, his face betrayed no fear. If anything, there was the faintest trace of a smirk. He had heard the verdict. He knew he would not hang, would not even rot in prison. 6 years in a school? To him, it was not punishment. It was time. Time to learn, time to perfect, time to wait. The community of Southmere breathed a sigh of relief, believing the nightmare was over. But they could not have been more wrong, for the boy with the marble eye was far from finished. The gates of the Westboro State Reform School clanged shut behind Edwin Grayson in the autumn of 1872. To the townspeople of Southmere, it felt like a resolution. The monster had been locked away. Their children could once again play in the streets. But what they did not understand was that Westboro was not a cage for Edwin. It was a classroom. The Reform School had been founded on an optimistic philosophy, that no child was beyond redemption. Its halls were filled with boys convicted of theft, vagrancy, petty crimes. The staff believed that structure, education, and religious instruction could mend broken souls. They believed discipline could mold boys into men. Edwin quickly understood what they wanted from him. He became the model student. He attended chapel every Sunday, bowed his head at prayers, answered his teachers with polite respect. In classes, he applied himself diligently, his intelligence shining through in lessons on reading, arithmetic, and scripture. He even volunteered for chores, sweeping floors, tending the small gardens behind the school. The wardens praised him openly. A troubled boy, they said, but one showing promise. They wrote reports describing him as cooperative, remorseful, eager to improve. Edwin listened carefully to every word, filing it away. He was learning not just arithmetic and scripture, but something far more valuable: how to wear a mask. Behind that mask, the darkness did not fade. It grew. In stolen moments, when no one watched, he still traced patterns of cruelty in his notebooks, still remembered the terror in his victim's eyes, still savored the memory of nearly drowning a boy in stagnant water. The hunger remained, gnawing at him, demanding to be fed. What Westboro truly gave Edwin was time. Time to refine his performance, to practice deception, to understand how easily adults could be fooled. He learned how to tell them exactly what they wanted to hear, how to mimic contrition, how to play the part of a boy on the path to redemption. And beyond the walls, Martha Grayson worked tirelessly. She visited often, bringing food and small comforts. She pleaded with administrators, insisting her son had been misunderstood, that he had been led astray by cruel circumstances. Her devotion was tireless, her denial unshaken. She wanted him home, and she would not stop until she had him back. By late 1873, scarcely 18 months into his 6-year sentence, the reports from Westboro were glowing. Improved, reformed, safe for release. Officials, eager to prove the success of their methods, welcomed the chance to demonstrate a victory. And so, in February of 1874, Edwin Grayson walked free. 14 years old, leaner, taller, and far more dangerous than when he entered. The marble eye still clouded his gaze, but now he wielded it as part of his disguise. A boy who looked pitiable, misunderstood, worthy of a second chance. The people of Southmere were never warned. No announcement was made to the community that had once lived in fear of him. He simply returned to Broad Street, where his mother had opened a small dressmaking shop, and took up work behind the counter. To neighbors, he appeared reformed, a quiet boy helping his mother. To his mother, he was a son restored. But inside, Edwin's hunger was no longer patient. It had been starved for nearly 2 years, and now it demanded to be fed. The boy with the marble eye was ready to escalate beyond cruelty. He was ready to kill. March 18th, 1874. The early spring air of Southmere was crisp, carrying the mingled smells of coal smoke and brine from the harbor. On Broad Street, Martha Grayson's dressmaking shop bustled with quiet activity. The little storefront had become a modest success, serving immigrant families who could not afford fine tailoring but needed sturdy clothes and mended hems. Behind the counter that day stood Edwin, 14 now, his lean frame taller, his voice deeper, his marble eye no less unsettling. That morning, Catherine O'Neill, known to her friends simply as Katie, left her family's apartment on a simple errand. 10 years old, bright-eyed and brimming with excitement, she had saved pennies for weeks to buy a small notebook for her lessons. Her parents, Irish immigrants, cherished her education as the hope of a better future. Katie skipped down Broad Street, coins clutched in her hand. She passed by the Grayson shop, as she often did, and hesitated. She knew Mrs. Grayson sold small notions. Needles, thread, scraps of paper. It was convenient. She stepped inside, the little bell above the door chiming as she entered. Behind the counter, Edwin looked up. For weeks he had been simmering, his hunger sharpened by the restraint forced upon him at Westboro. He had stalked alleys, watched children, waited for the right moment. And now, as Katie smiled brightly and greeted him, that moment arrived. No one knows exactly what transpired in those next minutes. There were no witnesses, no surviving victim to speak. Only Edwin himself, who later offered fragments of confession. But what is certain is this: Katie never walked out of the shop again. While his mother worked in the back room, distracted by her sewing, Edwin lured the girl to the basement. Whether it was with promises of paper for her notebook or a simple request for help, we cannot know. What we do know is that once below ground, surrounded by shadows and the smell of coal ash, Edwin's restraint finally snapped. He killed her there. How? He never fully revealed. Some believe he used a knife. Others, that he strangled her in silence. Whatever the method, the result was final. Katie O'Neill's bright voice was silenced forever. The problem Edwin faced then was not in the act, but in the aftermath. What to do with the body? In haste, he dug through the heap of ash and coal dust piled in the basement corner, a place where the refuse of winters past had gathered. There, he buried Katie's small frame beneath layers of soot and debris. The concealment was crude, imperfect, but enough to deceive. When Katie failed to return home, her parents grew frantic. Neighbors scoured the alleys, the yards, the riverbanks. The police canvassed every shop along Broad Street. They entered the Grayson store, questioning both Martha and Edwin. Calmly, with rehearsed composure, Edwin told them Katie had stopped by but left soon after, her purchase in hand. Martha, whether knowingly or blinded by love, corroborated his story. The officers even searched the basement, lanterns casting their glow across the piles of ash. But to them it looked like nothing more than coal refuse, not the shallow grave it concealed. Edwin stood nearby, feigning concern, even suggesting where else they might look. His performance was flawless. Days passed. Katie's disappearance shook the neighborhood. The O'Neill family clung to hope, but each passing morning without her return deepened the dread. And all the while she lay beneath the Grayson shop, her presence hidden by soot, her absence gnawing at the heart of Southmere. For Edwin, the act was intoxicating. He had crossed the line that had tempted him since Harrowgate, the line between torment and death. He had killed, concealed, deceived, and walked away untouched. In his twisted reasoning, this was victory. Proof that he was cleverer than the police, stronger than suspicion, and above all, in control. And once tasted, such power could never be surrendered. For a few weeks after Katie O'Neill vanished, a tense quiet settled over Southmere. Search parties combed the marshes, the rail lines, and the riverbanks. Posters with Katie's name and description were nailed to lampposts and tavern walls. Mothers whispered her name in prayers at Mass. Fathers clenched their fists in helpless rage. Yet the trail went cold. And in the Grayson household, life appeared unchanged. Martha kept her shop open, mending clothes for working families. Edwin manned the counter, polite, seemingly docile. Neighbors noted how calm he seemed, how unaffected by the hysteria that gripped the community. But inside, Edwin was exhilarated. He had deceived them all. His mother, the police, the entire neighborhood. Katie's body lay hidden beneath their very feet, and no one suspected. But the hunger did not fade. It grew. The thrill of power, the intoxicating sense of control, demanded more. Edwin did not want merely to kill again. He wanted to savor it, to linger, to watch terror unfold slowly. On April 22, 1874, Edwin found his next victim. 4-year-old Horace Miller, a cherubic boy with golden curls, played in the alley behind his family's tenement. His parents were poor but devoted, working long hours to keep food on the table. To them, Horace was joy itself, the light of their household. That afternoon, neighbors saw him talking with a taller boy, one with an odd, cloudy eye. No one thought to intervene. Edwin led Horace by the hand, promising candy and a secret game. They walked nearly an hour through winding streets and out toward the salt marshes of Dorchester Bay. The further they went, the quieter it grew, until the city's noise fell away, leaving only the rustle of reeds in the breeze. There, Edwin revealed his true face. He forced Horace to strip away his coat and shoes, leaving the child shivering in the cool air. He cut shallow X-shaped wounds into his small arms and legs, careful to avoid killing blows, prolonging the agony. He pressed Horace's face into the marsh water, pulling him back again and again, savoring each gasp and scream. Finally, in an act of savagery that horrified even the hardened officers who later examined the body, Edwin ended the child's life with a brutal slash to the throat. The violence did not stop with death. He desecrated the body further, acts so grotesque that newspapers would later veil the details in euphemism. And then, as if to erase his crime with fire, he set the remains alight in the reeds. The next morning, 2 brothers gathering clams stumbled upon the shallow pit of blackened earth and what lay within it. When word spread, crowds gathered, some fainting at the sight, others weeping openly. The scale of cruelty was beyond imagination. It was not only murder, it was annihilation of innocence. The police at last could no longer deny what many had whispered. The boy with the marble eye was real. Suspicion turned swiftly to Edwin Grayson. Officers searched his home and found scratches on his arms, blood on his clothing, and boots that matched prints left in the marsh. When confronted with the evidence, Edwin did not cry or plead. He did not even attempt to lie. Instead, when shown the broken body of Horace Miller, he looked down with the same blank indifference he had carried since childhood. Asked directly if he had killed the child, he replied simply, "I suppose I did." The words sent shivers through the men in the room, and then, almost casually, he confessed to more. He claimed responsibility for other disappearances, other children. The number he gave, dozens, was so staggering that the police dismissed it at first as fantasy. Yet his knowledge of certain unsolved cases made them pause. And soon, as investigators dug beneath the ash heap in the Grayson basement, they uncovered the remains of Katie O'Neill, exactly where Edwin had left her. The nightmare had reached its peak. The town no longer whispered. It howled for justice. December 1874. The courthouse of Suffolk County was swollen with bodies. Men in wool coats pressed shoulder to shoulder. Women clutched handkerchiefs to their mouths. Reporters scribbled feverishly in their ledgers. Never before had the state seen such a spectacle. A trial for first-degree murder, not of a hardened criminal, but of a 14-year-old boy. Edwin Grayson sat at the defense table, pale hands folded, his cloudy eye drifting across the room with unsettling calm. He had grown taller during his months in the Charles Street jail, but his face was still soft with the roundness of youth. To many in the crowd, that was the most terrifying sight of all. The juxtaposition of a child's appearance with the savagery of his crimes. The prosecution's case was devastating. They laid out every step. Katie O'Neill lured into the Grayson dress shop and buried in ash beneath the basement floor. Horace Miller led to the marshes, tortured, slain, desecrated. Evidence of rope, bloodstains, boot prints. The testimony of survivors from Harrowgate and Southmere, their voices shaking as they described Edwin's methods. Piece by piece, the picture was drawn with stark clarity. This was no accident, no madness without intent. This was deliberate cruelty, escalating into murder. The jury listened in grim silence. Each witness, each fragment of evidence chipped away at any doubt. And then came Edwin's own words, read aloud from his confession. He had admitted it plainly, without remorse. "I suppose I did." The phrase echoed through the chamber like a curse. The defense, led by attorney Charles Robbins, fought desperately. He invoked Edwin's age, his abusive father, the torment of schoolyard cruelty. He argued that no child could be fully responsible, that Edwin was either insane or so damaged by circumstance that true accountability was impossible. Experts testified about his mental state, about the cloudy eye, about brain defects that might explain his violence. But none of it outweighed the cold calculation of his actions. He had planned, lured, concealed, deceived. That was not insanity. That was intent. The jury retired briefly. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The law required death. Judge Horace Gray pronounced the sentence with visible reluctance. Edwin Grayson, at just 14, was condemned to hang. The gallery erupted, some with cheers, others with gasps. Mothers wept openly, fathers shouted approval. Yet beneath the clamor, unease lingered. To execute a child, no matter how monstrous, seemed to many like crossing a boundary civilization had never meant to cross. For 2 years, the boy with the marble eye sat on death row as politicians and governors debated his fate. The public demanded justice, but conscience pulled in another direction. Was it right to kill a child in the name of justice? Would executing him bring peace, or merely prove that society itself could be as ruthless as the boy they condemned? Finally, in 1876, the governor commuted his sentence. Edwin Grayson would not hang. Instead, he would live out his life in solitary confinement at Charlestown Prison. At just 16 years old, he was locked in a cell 6 feet by 8, with only a cot, a bucket, and a shelf for his meager belongings. For decades, he remained there. He grew into a man in isolation, his eye blind, his body frail, but his mind restless. He attempted escapes, fashioned crude tools from scraps, even blinded himself further in a botched explosion. He taught himself languages, wrote poetry, studied law, filling page after page with arguments for his release. Yet never once did he express remorse for Katie or Horace, never once acknowledge the agony of the children who had survived him. By the time of his death in 1932, Edwin Grayson had spent nearly 60 years behind bars, longer than any prisoner in the state's history. He died blind, aged, in a hospital for the criminally insane, buried in an unmarked grave. No family attended, no prayers were offered. The boy with the marble eye left the world as he had entered it, unwanted, feared, and alone. And yet, his story lived on. Courts cited his case in debates over whether children could be tried as adults. Psychiatrists dissected his life in search of answers to questions that still haunt us. Was Edwin Grayson born evil, or shaped by cruelty, neglect, and abuse? Can society ever prevent the making of a monster? Or does darkness sometimes bloom in places we cannot see until it is too late? In the end, the legacy of Edwin Grayson is not only in the graves he filled, but in the questions he left behind. Questions about innocence, responsibility, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the face of evil is that of a child.